comes a moment in every life when things shift. Not because the world suddenly got easier, or because the opportunities changed, but because the standard did. One quiet decision to no longer tolerate a certain behavior, or just as powerful, a new decision about how things will be done from this point forward. One standard raised can do what motivation can't. It can do what talent won't. It can create more change than 100 goals ever could, because standards are different. Standards aren't things you hope for. They're things you live by. They're not dreams. They're your minimums, and your life always rises or falls to meet your minimums. We talk a lot about achievement. We talk a lot about success, about goals, about discipline. But all of that starts here, with standards. And what most people don't realize is that they're already living by standards. Every day, you have a standard for how you treat your body, a standard for what kind of work you turn in, a standard for how you speak to people. The question is, are those standards intentional, or are they something you settled into over time? Because here's what I've seen. Most people don't need to overhaul their lives. They don't need more information. They don't even need more time. They need to raise one standard, one shift in what they accept from themselves, one upgrade to what they tolerate, one non-negotiable added to their code. And suddenly, everything else begins to adjust around that decision. It could be something as small as no longer hitting snooze, no longer blaming circumstances. Or it could be something as simple as deciding that from now on, when you say you'll do something, you do it. Not most of the time, every time. And here's what's incredible. When one standard changes, the ripple is immediate. You raise the bar in one area, and suddenly you start noticing where else you've been settling. It's like the lights come on. What used to feel acceptable now feels beneath you. Not because you're arrogant, but because you decided to expect more from yourself. You raise the floor, and when the floor rises, so does everything built on top of it. This isn't about being harsh with yourself. It's not about perfection. It's about alignment, about looking at the life you say you want and asking whether your standards match that vision. Because if they don't, no goal will get you there. No ambition will be enough. You'll keep slipping back to the level you've allowed. But when you raise just one standard and protect it fiercely, everything changes. Your focus sharpens. Your decisions become easier. You start to attract different opportunities, different people, different outcomes. Not because the world changed, but because you did. All those years ago, Mr. Schoaf showed me what a standard really is. How just one raised standard can alter the course of an entire life. A standard isn't a wish. It's not something you write on a vision board or whisper during a motivational video. A standard is what you do. It's what you allow. It's the invisible line that separates what's acceptable from what isn't, without needing a reward, without needing a reminder. It's the baseline you return to when no one's watching. And that baseline, that's what's shaping your life. If a goal is something you reach for, a standard is something you stand on. And here's the truth. Your life doesn't rise to meet your goals. It settles at the level of your standards. You can dream all you want, but if your standard's low, your results will match it. Not because you don't care, but because you've trained yourself to accept good enough. You've trained yourself to tolerate things that don't serve you. You can usually find someone's standards in the little moments. The person who always shows up 5 minutes late, there's a standard there. The one who lets texts go unanswered for weeks, who skips workouts as soon as they're tired, who makes excuses when things get hard. It's all standards, not because they made a decision to fall short, but because they never made a decision not to. Standards aren't loud. They don't need to be. They live in the quiet corners of your life. They're in the tone you use when you talk to yourself. They're in the way you keep your environment. They're in how you end your day, how you show up under pressure, how you follow through on small commitments. And most people don't even realize they've set them. They just slide into patterns and call them personality. But personality didn't create the pattern. Repetition did. And that repetition became the new normal. You'll hear people say things like, they're just not a morning person, they're terrible with money, or they always forget names. And they don't say it with intention. They say it like it's permanent, like it's part of who they are. But more often than not, it's not a truth. It's a standard. A bar they've been stepping over for so long, they forgot they could raise it. You see this everywhere. Some people have a standard for health. They move their body every day, no matter what. Others don't. Some people have a standard for honesty. They don't lie, even when it's uncomfortable. Others bend the truth anytime it's convenient. Some have a standard for excellence. They do their best, even when it goes unnoticed. Others do just enough to get by. And here's what's wild. Both types of people think their behavior's normal. Why? Because it's their standard. And once something becomes your standard, you no longer have to think about it. It becomes automatic, effortless. That's the beauty and the danger of standards. They build silently. And eventually, they either lift you or limit you. That's why so many people live lives that are smaller than their potential. Not because they don't care, not because they aren't capable, but because their standards don't demand more. Here's what most people miss. Your standards aren't set by your circumstances. They're set by your decisions. Circumstances can put pressure on your standards, sure, but they can't define them unless you allow it. And once you accept that, once you see your standards as a choice, not a sentence, you become powerful, because now you can change them. So what happens when you do? What happens when you raise just one standard? When you move from usually to always? When you stop letting something slide and make it non-negotiable? That's where things start shifting. That's when life starts moving differently. Because a new standard doesn't just change behavior. It changes identity. It changes how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you make decisions. It rewires what you'll accept and what you'll no longer entertain. It filters your environment. It changes who wants to be around you. And before long, that one raised standard becomes a new normal. And that new normal becomes a new life. And what an incredible shift. The things that happen when one standard gets raised and how it begins to ripple through everything else you touch, because that's where the real transformation begins. Raise one standard, just one, and watch what happens. Watch how fast the rest of your life starts to shift around it. Not because you tried to change everything, not because you overhauled your whole routine, but because one new, non-negotiable doesn't stay in a box. It spills over. It sends a signal to everything else that we don't operate at the old level anymore. Let's say you raise your standard for how you start your day. You decide that from now on, you're not watching TV, checking the news. No. Now you wake up on time, drink a glass of water, move your body, and set your focus. That seems small, But now your mornings are different, which means your energy is different, which means your decisions are different, which means your results are different. One standard raised and the ripple has begun. The same thing happens in your finances. Maybe you decide not to spend without tracking. That one standard, just that, forces other behaviors to change. You start checking your budget. You start thinking before you buy. You start asking better questions about where your money's going. Suddenly you're more intentional. You're in control. Not because you made 10 changes, but because you made one. One standard forces everything around it to recalibrate. When you raise the floor, the ceiling eventually rises with it. And this doesn't just apply to performance. It applies to how you treat people, to how you speak, to how you dress, to how you think. Raise your standard in one area and your identity starts to follow, because you can't keep acting like the old version of you while living by a higher standard. The two don't mix. And here's the part most people don't see coming. Once you raise one standard, you start to notice all the other areas where your life is lagging behind. You wake up earlier and suddenly realize your nutrition has been sloppy. You clean up your finances and suddenly notice how disorganized your schedule is. It's not judgment, it's clarity. And clarity leads to change. Because raising one standard doesn't just improve outcomes. It sharpens awareness. It trains your brain to look for excellence, to look for integrity. And once you see it in one area, you can't unsee it in others. That's how the ripple works. It starts at the center and keeps spreading. You see this in leadership too. A leader raises their standard for communication. Suddenly, the team communicates better. They raise their standard for preparation. Suddenly, meetings are more focused. Not because they changed the whole system overnight, but because they changed one point of contact, and the environment adjusted around it. The same is true in relationships. You raise your standard for how you speak when you're angry, and the entire tone of the relationship begins to shift. You raise your standard for how present you are when you're together. Suddenly, the connection feels deeper. Nothing dramatic. Just one new expectation. One new line in the sand. And everything adjusts. This is why one raised standard is so powerful. It does more than improve results. It changes your level of respect for yourself. It rewires your default settings. It makes you uncomfortable with old excuses. And that's where real transformation begins. Not when you try to fix everything, but when you refuse to tolerate just one thing a minute longer. Because standards aren't neutral. They're magnetic. They either pull you up or they pull you down. And once you lift one, the others can't help but follow. You begin to expect more, not just from yourself, but from your environment. And that expectation becomes your new center. But here's the truth. As powerful as the ripple effect is, it doesn't happen without friction. The moment you raise a standard, resistance shows up, internally and externally. And if you're not ready for it, it can talk you right back down to the level you worked so hard to rise above. I'm telling you, this is what shows up the moment you decide to expect more from yourself, and how to stay the course when everything around you tries to pull you back. That's what we're going to talk about. The moment you raise a standard, truly raise it, not just in your mind, but in your behavior, in your choices, in your expectations. Resistance will show up. Not maybe, not sometimes, every time. Because standards don't rise quietly. They create tension. They create friction. The old version of you starts to pull back. Your environment starts to test you. And it can be confusing. Because just when you expect to feel proud or empowered for raising the bar, you feel uncomfortable instead. doubt creeps in. The voice in your head gets louder. It questions who you think you are. It tells you this won't last. It whispers that nobody's watching. So you might as well go back. That voice isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that something's changing. It's the old standard fighting to stay alive. Because the moment you challenge it, you threaten its survival. And the mind doesn't like to let go of what's familiar, even when what's familiar isn't good for you. You know, on the inside, resistance sounds like self-doubt, like imposter syndrome, like second-guessing the very decision you felt certain about yesterday. You'll question whether you can keep it up, whether you're being too strict, whether you're doing it for the right reasons. And that questioning doesn't mean you made the wrong call. It means you're stepping into a level of responsibility that your old self wasn't built for. But here's where people slip. They mistake discomfort for danger. They assume that because it feels awkward, it must not be right. But growth always feels awkward. Up-leveling always feels unnatural at first. You're stretching into something new. Of course it's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Then comes the external resistance. The people around you will notice. Not always directly, and not always kindly. Sometimes it shows up as sarcasm, jokes, or eye rolls. Sometimes it's more direct. Comments about how you've changed, how you're too rigid now, or questions about why you're taking things so seriously. It's not always malicious, but it's real. And if you're not ready for it, it can knock you right back down to the old level. See, when you raise your standard, you challenge the status quo, not just in your own life, but in the lives of the people around you. You become a mirror. You reflect back to others what they're not doing. And some people don't like what they see. Not because they don't support you, but because your change makes them uncomfortable with their own lack of it. So they push back. Not always consciously, but consistently. And that's when you have to decide, was this standard a preference or a principle? Is this something I was just trying or something I'm becoming? Because if it's real, if it's true, you'll hold it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's lonely, even when it costs you something. That's what standards are, not decorations, not things you declare. They're things you protect, not just when they're easy, but especially when they're hard. Because anyone can raise a standard for a day, but the ones who keep them, the ones who protect them, they're the ones whose lives change. So what do you do when resistance shows up? First, you expect it. You don't treat it like an interruption. You treat it like confirmation. Resistance means you're shifting. Resistance means you're doing something real. Second, you prepare for it. You build habits and systems that make falling back harder. You surround yourself with people who reinforce the new standard. You remove things from your life that threaten it. You stop negotiating with your old self, the one who made excuses, the one who settled, the one who broke promises in private. That version of you doesn't get a vote anymore. They're not in charge. Your new standard is. And you don't rise to meet a new standard. You rise because you refuse to fall below it anymore. This is the part that refines you. This is the part that solidifies the shift. If you can hold steady when resistance shows up, if you can protect the standard when everything in you wants to go back, you've already won. The results will come. The ripple will follow. But the victory is in the choice. So what standard do you raise? That's a good question, right? Of all the areas in your life, your time, your health, your relationships, your word, which one would make the biggest difference if it changed right now? Because one raised standard chosen intentionally can shift the weight of your entire life. Not every standard needs to change, not all at once. That's where people get overwhelmed. They try to fix everything and end up fixing nothing. The real shift happens when you raise just one, and you raise it all the way. One standard, fully enforced, can change the entire trajectory of your life. So the question becomes, which one? Which area of your life, if you raise the bar, would start pulling everything else up with it? You probably already know. It's the one you've been thinking about, the one that makes you uncomfortable, the one you've been avoiding because deep down you know it's costing you. Start by asking yourself, what have I been tolerating? Not just what's been going wrong, but what have I let slide? What excuses have I been rehearsing? What corners have I been cutting? What version of myself have I been protecting because it's familiar, even though it's not honest? Because the truth is, we don't rise by changing everything. We rise by changing what we tolerate. If you want a different life, you start by refusing to live at the old level. You start by identifying one area where you say, enough, no more compromise, no more gray area. From now on, this is the line. Maybe it's your time. You've been giving it away carelessly, saying yes to everything, letting the day control you. And it's time to raise the standard, to protect your time like it matters, because it does. Maybe it's your health. Not chasing a perfect body, just refusing to keep treating your body like an afterthought. Maybe it's your word. No more loose promises. No more, I'll try. From now on, your word means something, even in private, especially in private. Maybe it's your environment, the people you surround yourself with, the conversations you allow, the energy you accept. You know you've outgrown certain dynamics, but you've stayed because it's easier. But easy doesn't build legacy. Maybe it's your thinking, raising the standard for what kind of thoughts you entertain. Not every thought deserves a seat at your table. Wherever the gap is, find it. And don't pick something trendy. Don't pick the thing that sounds good in a caption. Pick the one that hits deep, the one that stings a little, the one that would force you to level up. Not just in action, but in identity. That's how you know you've found the one. Because not all standards are created equal. Some are surface level. They change behavior, but not belief. They shift routines, but not outcomes. But some standards go deeper. They change who you believe yourself to be. They affect how you speak, how you carry yourself, how you decide what you will and will not allow. Those are the ones that create real change. Those are the ones worth raising. And once you pick it, define it clearly. Vague standards create vague results. Wanting to be more consistent means nothing until you commit to never missing more than one day in a row. Wanting to be more focused becomes powerful when you decide the phone stays off for the first hour of the day. Clarity is everything. If it's not defined, it won't be defended. Now write it down. Speak it out loud. Not to impress anyone, but to declare it to yourself. Make it real. Make it visible. Make it something you can measure, something you can protect. Because from this moment forward, this is no longer just a preference. It's a line, a rule, a new law in your life. And here's what happens when you make that decision. When you draw that line and actually enforce it, you don't just behave differently. You become different, slowly, quietly, steadily. Your standards rewrite your identity. They don't just shape what you do, they shape who you are. And this is what it takes to make this new standard stick, to build it so deep into your life that it becomes automatic, that it becomes non-negotiable, that it becomes who you are, even when no one's watching. Raising a standard is powerful, but making it permanent, that's what changes your life. Because anyone can raise the bar for a day, maybe even a week. But until that new standard becomes part of who you are, it's just temporary pressure. It won't last. That's why the real goal isn't just to act differently. It's to believe differently, to see yourself as someone who simply doesn't live the old way anymore. Not because you're forcing it, but because it no longer fits. It no longer aligns. It no longer feels like you. That's the shift. That's when the standard isn't just something you practice. It's something you protect. So how do you get there? How do you turn a raised standard into a permanent part of your identity? You start by reinforcing it daily, not just with action, but with intention. You repeat it over and over again until it becomes automatic, until it becomes the new normal. Because repetition builds belief, and belief shapes behavior. Say it out loud. Write it down. Build routines around it. Align your environment with it. If your new standard is that you plan every day before it begins, set up a space that makes it easy. Keep your journal in plain sight. Create a ritual around it. Make the habit frictionless and the excuse harder. The more accessible the behavior, the more likely it becomes automatic. And protect the language around it. Stop saying you're trying to do something or that you need to get better at it, and start declaring that this is who you are now. Identity follows language. The more you speak like someone who lives by that standard, the more your mind aligns with it, the more others begin to recognize it, and the more consistent your behavior becomes. But be prepared. There will be days when the old standard tries to sneak back in. It'll show up quietly. Just this once. Today's different. You've been good lately. You deserve a break. And that's when the real work begins. Not in the decision, but in the defense of it. You don't just set a new standard, you build a wall around it. You protect it from drift, from compromise, from convenience. And that protection doesn't mean perfection. You'll have days when you slip, days when you don't hit the mark. That's okay. What matters most is that you don't stay there. The raised standard is still your home base. You get back to it quickly, without drama, without shame. You simply return, because that's who you are now. Eventually, something amazing happens. What once felt like effort becomes effortless. What once required discipline becomes default. The standard you used to struggle to maintain now feels natural, automatic, expected. And when that happens, you'll start to notice other things. New opportunities show up. Different people are drawn to you. The way you talk, the way you walk, the way you lead, all of it carries weight because you're no longer trying to become the person you already are. That's the beauty of raising a standard. You don't just change your results, you change your reputation, internally and externally. You begin to trust yourself at a deeper level. You no longer need accountability to do the right thing. You just do it because it's who you are. And once that happens, you realize something else. Your new standard doesn't have to be the ceiling. It can be the floor. Once you've stabilized it, you can raise it again and again. Because growth doesn't stop at good. Mastery lives in the next level. And the people who live extraordinary lives, they don't settle at the first elevation. They keep climbing. So take this standard, build it deep into who you are, Repeat it, speak it, act on it, protect it. Make it automatic. Let it become part of your story. And then, when it's solid, raise it again. Not because you're chasing perfection, but because you know the power of one standard. And now you've seen what happens when just one gets raised. One standard, that's all it takes. Not 100 new habits, not a massive reinvention. Just one line in the sand. One decision to operate differently from this point forward. And if you hold it, if you protect it, reinforce it, live it, it won't just change one part of your life. It'll touch everything. Because standards don't exist in isolation. They ripple, they compound. They raise the floor beneath your feet, and they force everything around you to rise with them. You don't need more time. You don't need more motivation. You don't need a breakthrough. You need one raised standard and the discipline to live by it. You need to stop negotiating with the old version of you. And you need to start honoring the new one before anyone else does. So what will it be? What's the one standard you're done compromising on? Name it, write it down, speak it, and then live it, especially when it's hard, especially when no one's watching. Because you don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your standards. Raise them, and everything changes.